Tonight, we drift into the dark and haunting world of Resident Evil, exploring the full timeline of Umbrella, Raccoon City, Wesker, Leon, Claire, Jill, and the horrors that changed this universe forever. If you enjoy relaxing game lore and sleep stories like this, subscribe to Midnight Lore, like the video, and let this story carry you gently into the night.
Tonight, let us step away from the noise of the ordinary world and drift gently into a darker one, a world of abandoned mansions and silent laboratories, a world of secret experiments, buried files, dying cities, and old ambitions so dangerous that they reshaped the lives of countless people, a world where fear does not always come from monsters alone. Sometimes, fear begins with human curiosity. Sometimes, with greed. Sometimes, with the calm voice of a scientist who believes that death is only a technical problem waiting to be solved. This is the world of Resident Evil. And tonight, we begin not with gunfire, not with alarms, and not with the shambling footsteps of the infected. We begin much earlier, before the outbreaks, before the ruined police stations, before the fall of cities, before names like Raccoon City, S.T.A.R.S, or bioorganic weapon became part of a global nightmare. To understand the story of Resident Evil, we must begin with an old and unsettling idea, the idea that life itself can be controlled, improved, rewritten, that nature is not sacred, but merely unfinished. And among the many people who would eventually shape this world, few were more important than those who believed that biology was not simply something to study, but something to master. Long before the modern pharmaceutical giant known as Umbrella became known to the public as a respectable company, its truest roots lay hidden beneath wealth, obsession, and secret ambition. In the mountains of Africa, in a remote and ancient region, there existed a strange natural phenomenon that would quietly shape the future of the world. There, a species of flower, later known for its connection to the Progenitor virus, became central to a discovery that would change history. This flower, associated with the stairway to the sun, was not just botanically unusual. It hinted at something far more dangerous, a naturally occurring biological power, a pathway through which the boundaries of life might be altered. In that ancient place, long before modern corporations weaponized virology, there was already a seed of transformation waiting to be understood. The existence of such a thing fascinated certain people for obvious reasons. To a ruthless visionary, a discovery like this was not merely scientific, it was almost mythic, a doorway, a key. One of the most important men drawn to this possibility was Oswell E. Spencer. Spencer was wealthy, brilliant in his own cold way, and consumed by an idea far larger than business. He did not see science as a path to healing. Not really. He saw it as a path to control, power, and ultimately transcendence. He believed in selective human advancement, in superiority, in shaping the future not through ethics or democracy, but through guided evolution directed by those he considered worthy. There is something deeply disturbing about Spencer because he is not driven by simple madness. He is methodical, patient, educated, refined. He He is the kind of man who can speak the language of progress while quietly planning something monstrous. Alongside Spencer were other important figures, among them Edward Ashford and James Marcus. Together, these men would become foundational to the creation of Umbrella, but they were not united by kindness or by a shared desire to help humanity. They were united by access, knowledge, ambition, and the possibilities hidden within viral research. Spencer sought power and a godlike reshaping of the human future. Marcus pursued discovery with dangerous intensity, often crossing lines that ordinary scientific morality would never allow. Ashford's legacy would become equally important through his family line, especially later, when the obsession with genetic excellence and aristocratic restoration took its own strange path. In the beginning, though, these men stood near the same source of dangerous promise. The future Umbrella founders became linked through research into the Progenitor virus, a foundational viral agent associated with extraordinary mutagenic potential. Even at this early stage, what mattered was not simply disease, it was transformation. That is one of the core themes of Resident Evil. Viruses in this world are rarely treated as mere illness. They are engines of change. Their danger lies not only in death, but in what comes after death, or after infection, or after mutation. They do not simply end lives. They distort them, reconstruct them, weaponize them. And this is where Resident Evil becomes more than a simple horror story. Because the people behind these discoveries do not see themselves as makers of horror. They see themselves as pioneers. That makes them far more dangerous. The company that would become Umbrella was built outwardly as a pharmaceutical empire. This was an ideal cover. Pharmaceuticals suggest healing, trust, medicine, research, public good. A company built on that image could move through the world with respectability, influence, and political insulation. But hidden beneath the surface was something much darker. Umbrella's true power lay in clandestine bioweapons research, illegal experimentation, covert facilities, and the development of viral agents that could reshape organisms into weapons, monsters, or unstable horrors. Its public face was clean. Its private work was catastrophic. This duality became one of the defining features of the entire Resident Evil timeline. Again and again, the story returns to the same terrible pattern. Respectable institutions hiding unbearable corruption, laboratories beneath mansions, secret trains beneath peaceful landscapes, executives beneath polished corporate speech. The surface is always controlled. The rot is always underneath. James Marcus, one of Umbrella's key researchers, became especially important in the early phases of this hidden empire. Marcus was brilliant, but like so many in the Resident Evil world, brilliance did not protect him from obsession. He conducted research that crossed ethical lines with disturbing ease, particularly in his work with leeches and viral biology. His experiments reflected a recurring truth in this universe. Once living systems are treated only as tools, cruelty becomes almost automatic. Marcus was not the only cruel man in Umbrella's orbit, but he was one of the earliest and most revealing. In him, we see the beginning of the company's moral decay turning into open monstrosity. Umbrella built training centers, research facilities, hidden laboratories, transport systems, and isolated complexes designed to support this secret work. Secrecy was essential. The outside world could not be allowed to know what was really happening, not because it would misunderstand, but because it would understand too well. And so Umbrella learned to bury its truth physically and politically. Facilities were placed underground, records were compartmentalized, staff loyalty was controlled, power flowed through silence. The company was not merely conducting unethical science, it was becoming an architecture of concealment. That matters, because in Resident Evil, horror is rarely random. It is engineered, not only biologically, but institutionally. There are always people who built the room, signed the order, approved the funding, erased the witness, or locked the door. The monsters are frightening, yes, but they are never the whole story. Behind them stands administration. As the early Umbrella network expanded, the company's internal relationships became increasingly tense. Spencer, Marcus, and others did not share power equally. Ambition, secrecy, and mistrust grew between them. This is another pattern that defines the series. Those who seek absolute control through bioengineering inevitably turn that logic against one another. You cannot build a world based on manipulation and then expect loyalty to remain pure. Eventually, Marcus's role within Umbrella became unstable. He had knowledge, but knowledge itself becomes dangerous in secret empires. The more essential a scientist becomes, the more threatening he may appear to those above him. Spencer, always calculating, did not build Umbrella to share his future with equals. He intended to stand above it. This tendency toward betrayal would shape not only Umbrella's leadership, but the entire future of the franchise. At almost every level of the Resident Evil story, powerful people use others until they become inconvenient. Scientists are discarded, soldiers are sacrificed, cities are written off, victims are treated as data. Human beings become acceptable losses. This is why the world of Resident Evil feels so cold even before the zombies appear. The emotional temperature of the story is already low. Compassion has been replaced by utility. And once that happens, catastrophe is only a matter of time. The rise of Umbrella was also tied to aristocratic ambition and inherited legacy, especially through the Ashford family, though later chapters would reveal much more about the family's decline, vanity, and tragic attempts at restoration. Even in the early foundations of Umbrella, there was already an unsettling mixture of old-world elitism and modern biological ambition. This blend is important. Resident Evil is never just about mad science in a futuristic sense. It is also about old power trying to survive through new methods. Castles, noble bloodlines, ancient insignia, and inherited obsession often stand beside laboratories, gene sequences, and viral cultures. The franchise understands something subtle and powerful. Sometimes the most modern horror is simply old human arrogance wearing new machinery. As years passed, Umbrella's reach expanded. Research into the Progenitor virus led toward the creation of other viral strains and experimental branches. The goal was never singular. Different people within the company wanted different outcomes. Some wanted marketable military applications. Some wanted prestige. Some wanted scientific dominance. And some, like Spencer, wanted something closer to a private evolutionary destiny. This fragmentation made Umbrella even more dangerous. A unified evil can be resisted in one way. A fractured network of overlapping ambitions is harder to contain, because it does not require total agreement to do terrible things. It only requires enough mutual benefit. And Umbrella had that in abundance. One of the defining nightmares of this universe is the development of bioorganic weapons, often shortened to BOWs. This concept lies at the center of so much that follows. A BOW is not merely an infected creature. It is something produced, shaped, or exploited for strategic use. A living weapon, a being whose body, mind, or mutation has been made useful for violence. This is one of the places where Resident Evil becomes especially chilling. The infected are tragic enough, But a world in which institutions deliberately seek to create monsters for deployment is something colder still. And Umbrella moved steadily toward that world. Not quickly in public, of course, not visibly, but beneath estates, under mountains, behind corporate walls, and inside sealed facilities, the future was being grown. Tanks, specimens, embryonic horrors, viral cultures in suspended glass, documents written in calm technical language about things that should never have existed. The aesthetic of Resident Evil emerges here in full, not simply blood and terror, but polished steel, medical tiles, computer terminals glowing in empty rooms, keycards, containment chambers, the sound of ventilation in underground spaces where no sunlight reaches. That atmosphere matters because the series does not usually ask us to fear chaos first. It asks us to fear order corrupted. A laboratory is frightening in Resident Evil not because it is messy, but because it is controlled. Someone designed it. Someone maintains it. Someone knew exactly what was inside. As we move closer to the events that would eventually erupt into the famous incidents of the series, it becomes important to understand that the first great disasters were never accidents in the simple sense. Yes, there would be leaks, failures, containment breaches, unexpected mutations, but beneath all of them was intention. The system itself was wrong. Its disasters were not interruptions of its purpose. They were consequences of its purpose. There is a difference. A normal institution experiences catastrophe when something goes wrong. Umbrella experiences catastrophe because its success is itself catastrophic. That is the true horror of the company. Even when its experiments work, they are already disasters. In time, internal power struggles intensified. Marcus's position weakened. Spencer, increasingly ruthless, moved to consolidate authority. Betrayal within Umbrella was not a flaw of character alone. It was built into the structure of how the company understood value. People mattered only insofar as they served the project. Marcus eventually became one of the victims of this logic. And yet, as Resident Evil often reminds us, death in this world does not always mean absence. The past returns. Research returns. Infection returns. What is buried rarely stays buried for long. These early betrayals within Umbrella would echo later in astonishing ways, especially in the events surrounding the Arklay Mountains and the hidden training facilities connected to the company's secret history. But before we reach the famous outbreaks, before the Spencer Mansion, before the train in the forest, before S.T.A.R.S. enters the nightmare, let us stay a little longer in this beginning. Imagine the silent corridors of Umbrella's earliest hidden compounds. Imagine the men in suits speaking softly over impossible research. Imagine the locked doors, refrigerated chambers, elevators descending beneath respectable architecture. Imagine a flower in ancient African sunlight becoming, through human obsession, the root of global biohazard. Imagine the first moment some scientist looked at viral mutation not as a warning, but as opportunity. That is where Resident Evil truly begins. Not in the bite, not in the corpse, but in the decision. The decision to treat life as a tool, to turn biology into property, to call domination progress. This is why the universe of Resident Evil feels so heavy and so strangely believable beneath its monsters. Because its greatest horror is not fantasy. Its greatest horror is a familiar human one. The belief that power and knowledge justify themselves. And once that belief takes hold, everything else follows. The company expands. The facilities deepen. The records multiply. The ethics disappear. And somewhere in the growing darkness, the conditions for future outbreaks are already taking shape. Soon, we will move toward the hidden events that prepared the road to the mansion incident. we will see the early field consequences of Umbrella's secret work, the beginnings of internal collapse, and the path toward the doomed investigation that would draw new names into the story. Names like Rebecca Chambers, Billy Cohen, Albert Wesker, Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine. But for now, let the world remain quiet. Let the labs stay sealed. Let the mountain roads remain empty in the dark. Let Umbrella still appear from a distance, like a respectable company with clean branding and controlled ambition. Because in that illusion, in that calm before revelation, lies one of the most important truths in all of Resident Evil. The nightmare was already built long before anyone realized it had escaped. And now, let us continue. The silence of Umbrella's early years still hangs in the air. The company remains hidden behind pharmaceutical respectability. Its executives still speak in controlled tones. Its laboratories still wait beneath the surface. Its secrets have not yet become public catastrophe. But something is beginning to shift, because the deeper a secret system grows, the more unstable it becomes from within. And in the early hidden history of Resident Evil, one of the most important fault lines runs through the life and work of James Marcus. Marcus was not merely one more Umbrella scientist. He was one of the company's intellectual foundations, one of the men closest to its earliest viral ambitions. He worked with the Progenitor virus and with biological systems whose mutational potential fascinated him beyond reason. Like many figures in Resident Evil, Marcus was brilliant in a way that made him dangerous, not only to others, but to the world around him. He crossed lines easily. He did not merely observe life. He manipulated it. And among the most disturbing aspects of his research was his fascination with leeches. At first, this sounds almost strangely specific, almost small compared to the scale of viral engineering. But Resident Evil often uses the unsettling intimacy of biology to its advantage. Leeches are not grand creatures. They are ancient, instinctive, parasitic, wet, and deeply uncomfortable to imagine in large numbers. Marcus saw in them not revulsion, but possibility. He experimented with combining viral research and leech biology in ways that reflected both his ingenuity and his moral collapse. In the world of Resident Evil, this is a familiar pattern. A scientist becomes convinced that an organism is not what it appears to be. What others dismiss as disgusting or trivial becomes, under obsession, a platform for transformation. Marcus believed he was seeing farther than other people. That belief can become a kind of intoxication. And within Umbrella, intoxicated genius was tolerated for as long as it remained useful. Marcus conducted much of his work in facilities connected to the Umbrella training complex and its wider hidden infrastructure. These were places not meant for public awareness. Officially, Umbrella trained personnel, developed products, and maintained a clean corporate identity. Unofficially, its compounds were full of experimental chambers, preserved records, hidden laboratories, and the physical residue of research that should never have been permitted to exist. One of the most important locations in this period was the Umbrella Executive Training School, hidden in the Arklay Mountains region. The very name has a sinister elegance to it. A training school, executive development, administration, leadership, respectable language. And yet beneath that respectable language stood something else, a site deeply linked to Marcus's research, Umbrella's private ambitions, and the biological horrors that were already beginning to take shape. The Arklay region is central to the earliest Resident Evil story for a reason. Mountains and forests create natural isolation. Roads are limited. Visibility is low. Facilities can be hidden. Strange events can be explained away. If one wished to bury dangerous research while maintaining access and control, the Arklay Mountains would be an ideal environment. And Umbrella knew that. These mountains would become the setting not only for research, but for the slow unraveling of the company's earliest local collapse. By this stage, Spencer's relationship with Marcus had deteriorated badly. Spencer, as always, preferred power that flowed upward toward himself. Marcus had become a liability, too knowledgeable, too independent, too tied to foundational secrets. Alongside Albert Wesker and William Birkin, both rising Umbrella operatives and researchers of great importance, Spencer moved against Marcus. This is one of the key early betrayals in the timeline. Wesker and Birkin, acting in Spencer's interest, were involved in the elimination of Marcus. Again, the pattern repeats. Umbrella does not merely perform unethical science. It devours its own creators when necessary. Marcus, once essential, became disposable. And yet, as always in Resident Evil, disposal does not guarantee disappearance. Marcus's body, exposed to the consequences of his own research and entwined with the mutagenic power of the organisms he studied, did not remain simply dead. The leeches mattered. The virus mattered. Time mattered. Out of all of this came one of the eeriest elements of Resident Evil 0, the return, or distorted continuation, of Marcus through the Queen Leech and its imitative forms. This is where the series becomes dreamlike in a disturbing way. The dead scientist does not merely leave notes behind. His will, memory, and grotesque biological legacy seem to return through mutation, mimicry, and parasitic continuity. The result is something far stranger than a normal revenge plot. It is as if the secret world Umbrella built has begun to reproduce its sins biologically. Marcus comes back not as a healed man, but as a corrupted echo. That is very Resident Evil. The past does not return cleanly. It returns through mutation. Now we move closer to the actual opening events of Resident Evil 0. Years of buried research, betrayal, and concealment have set the stage. Umbrella's infrastructure in the Arklay Mountains remains active, but unstable. The old crimes done in hidden rooms are beginning to ripple outward. Strange incidents emerge in the surrounding area. Bodies appear. Murders are reported. The atmosphere shifts from secrecy toward dread. The public does not yet understand what is happening. Authorities do not yet grasp the full scale. But the system is beginning to leak. To investigate the bizarre killings in the Arklay Mountains, the Raccoon Police Department sends in one of its elite units, S.T.A.R.S, the Special Tactics and Rescue Service. S.T.A.R.S is one of the most iconic organizations in the series, but here, we are still near its earliest contact with Umbrella's hidden nightmare. The team selected for this assignment is Bravo Team, and among Bravo Team is one of the key protagonists of Resident Evil 0, Rebecca Chambers. Rebecca is a fascinating character because she enters this universe young, intelligent, capable, and clearly trained, but not yet hardened into the emotional armor we associate with later survivors. She is a medic and support officer, highly competent for her age, but still carrying something that the series often strips away from people very quickly: openness. That openness matters, because Resident Evil is a world where innocence is not usually protected for long. Rebecca is not naive in a foolish sense. She is skilled, alert, and brave, but she has not yet become someone emotionally shaped by total catastrophe. She is stepping into horror before fully understanding what kind of world she has entered. Bravo Team never reaches its mission cleanly. On the way into the mountains, their helicopter suffers mechanical problems and crashes. This is the first sign that fate in Resident Evil rarely unfolds along straightforward lines. Travel breaks down, systems fail, isolation increases. The team is scattered into uncertainty even before the true horror begins. Searching the area, Bravo team discovers a military transport vehicle and the signs of violent death around it. They also discover that a dangerous prisoner is believed to be nearby. This prisoner is Billy Cohen. Billy Cohen is another central figure in Resident Evil Zero, and his role in the story adds a very important tone. Where Rebecca represents disciplined youth entering nightmare, Billy represents the morally ambiguous outsider, someone already marked by accusation, state violence, and the burden of a past others believe they understand. Billy is a former Marine lieutenant charged with mass murder. At least, that is the official story. Like many people in Resident Evil, Billy exists inside the gap between record and truth. He is introduced as someone dangerous, someone condemned, someone outside lawful trust. But the series does not leave that image untouched for long. Beneath the accusation is a man shaped by war, command failure, and institutional betrayal. That, too, is very Resident Evil. Systems label people, but the label is rarely the full truth. Rebecca first encounters Billy under tense circumstances, as one would expect. She is a S.T.A.R.S officer. He is an escaped prisoner in handcuffs. The situation should be simple. But in this universe, simplicity does not last. The greater threat grows around them too quickly. And that greater threat is waiting aboard one of the most memorable locations in Resident Evil Zero, the Ecliptic Express. There is something perfect about the Ecliptic Express as an early setting. A train is movement without freedom. It is elegance enclosed in rails. It is luxury made claustrophobic. Once something goes wrong on a train, options narrow quickly. Doors, compartments, corridors, and timing create natural tension. In Resident Evil, such spaces become ideal vessels for controlled panic. The Ecliptic Express begins as something almost refined, an umbrella-owned passenger train moving through the dark. But by the time Rebecca boards it, it has already become a nightmare in motion. The people aboard are dead or dying. The infected are spreading. Blood marks the corridors. The rhythm of the train continues, indifferent and mechanical, even as life collapses inside it. This kind of contrast is a hallmark of the franchise. Elegant surface, corruption within, motion continuing even after meaning has failed. Rebecca enters this environment alone at first, and that matters. Horror is magnified by uncertainty. She is young, far from secure support, inside an enclosed moving structure, surrounded by signs of infection she does not yet fully understand. What she encounters are not just corpses, but the earliest familiar symptoms of viral catastrophe: aggression, reanimation, bodily breakdown, and the terrifying loss of ordinary human boundaries. The dead do not stay still. The infected do not remain human in the ordinary sense. And yet, in these early moments, the full language of bioterror is still not fully available to Rebecca. She is experiencing the phenomenon before she can conceptually place it. That is always frightening. To name a thing is to gain some power over it. Resident Evil often denies that power at first. Billy also boards and moves through the Ecliptic Express, and soon Rebecca and Billy are forced toward uneasy cooperation. This relationship is one of the best parts of Resident Evil Zero because it grows not from trust, but from necessity. Rebecca cannot handle everything alone. Billy is capable, experienced, and already accustomed to violence and survival. But he is also dangerous, or at least potentially so. Rebecca has every reason to be cautious, yet caution in a collapsing world must coexist with adaptation. The infected do not care about procedural purity, and so the two become partners of circumstance. there is a subtle emotional rhythm in their partnership that works well for the series. Rebecca brings medical intelligence, discipline, and moral sincerity. Billy brings toughness, field experience, skepticism, and the instincts of someone who has already been failed by official narratives. Together, they make sense. Not because they are similar, but because the world around them requires complementary survival. As the train journey continues, the threat escalates. Zombies move through the compartments. Mutated creatures appear. The atmosphere thickens with the knowledge that this is not an isolated random disaster, but the product of research tied to Umbrella. And hovering around all of it is the uncanny presence of Marcus's returning legacy. The leeches are especially important here. Resident Evil Zero uses them not only as biological horror, but as symbolic horror. Leeches are wet memory. They cling, they feed, they replicate, they move in masses. Under Marcus's legacy, they become almost theatrical agents of vengeance, turning the train and later the training facility into stages where buried crime begins to make itself visible. This is where the tone of Resident Evil Zero becomes slightly more gothic than some later entries. There is a ghostly quality to Marcus's return, even though it is ultimately rooted in mutated biology rather than supernatural law. The story feels haunted, but by science distorted into something that imitates haunting. That is one of the series' great strengths. It creates the emotional experience of the supernatural while remaining, at least in its own terms, biologically grounded. As Rebecca and Billy survive the horrors of the Ecliptic Express, the train's fate turns grim. Mechanical failure and biological catastrophe combine. The journey cannot continue safely. The train eventually crashes, and the story transitions from one enclosed nightmare into another, the Umbrella training facility. If the train is horror in motion, the training facility is horror at rest. Here, the hidden history of Umbrella becomes more visible. Architecture, documents, laboratories, portraits, abandoned rooms, security systems, and experimental residues all tell a deeper story. Rebecca and Billy are no longer merely dealing with an outbreak. They are moving through the physical memory of Umbrella's secret world, and that changes the texture of fear, because now the environment itself begins to explain the nightmare. Not fully, not kindly, but enough. The facility reveals Marcus's old domain, Umbrella's buried structure, and the fact that what is happening now is linked to crimes done years earlier. Resident Evil is at its best when place becomes archive, and the training facility is exactly that, a museum of concealed ambition rotting from within. Here, the partnership between Rebecca and Billy deepens. Survival forces them to rely on each other more directly. Rebecca begins to see that Billy is not the simple monster described in his criminal file. Billy, in turn, sees that Rebecca is not weak, not merely a sheltered rookie, but someone with intelligence and courage enough to stand in impossible situations. There is a kind of quiet tenderness in that mutual recognition, though Resident Evil Zero does not overstate it. The world around them is too dangerous for sentimental ease, but shared survival reveals character, and that matters. At the same time, the wider implications of Umbrella's actions continue to gather force. The outbreak connected to the train and facility is not yet the full catastrophe the world will later remember. But it is a crucial threshold. It marks the moment where hidden research can no longer remain completely hidden. Local systems are already failing. Creatures are escaping containment. Records are surfacing. And the chain of events leading directly toward the mansion incident is almost complete. This is what makes Resident Evil Zero so important in the timeline. It is not merely a prequel in the simple sense. It is the final tightening of the spring before the first great snap. Rebecca's experience here prepares her for the terror to come. Umbrella's old betrayals begin surfacing into active consequence. Billy becomes one of the forgotten survivors, shaped by the edges of a nightmare that official history will not cleanly preserve. And the Arklay Mountains themselves begin to feel less like geography and more like a sealed pressure chamber slowly giving way. Let us pause for a moment and picture the atmosphere. Rain and forest beyond the wreckage. A luxury train turned charnel corridor. A young medic with a gun and too many questions. An accused killer whose past is not what it seems. Leeches moving where memory should rest. A training school that is really a laboratory of secrecy. Umbrella's past pushing upward into the present. This is how Resident Evil begins to truly breathe. Not yet with total urban collapse. Not yet with the world openly aware. But with local infection, hidden architecture, and two people moving deeper into a system of lies built long before they ever arrived. In the next part, we will continue through the training facility, Marcus's revenge, the deeper truth about Billy Cohen, the destruction of evidence, and the transition that leads directly into the events of the Spencer Mansion and Resident Evil 1. For now, let the train grow quiet. Let the wheels stop turning. Let the mountain air remain cold around the wreckage. And let Rebecca and Billy remain, just for a moment longer, at the threshold between secret history and the first great outbreak the world will almost, but not quite, manage to contain. And now, let us continue. The Ecliptic Express lies behind us now, broken and silent. Its polished compartments and narrow corridors have already become part of the larger nightmare. Rebecca Chambers and Billy Cohen have survived the train, but survival in Resident Evil is never simple escape. It is usually only transition. One danger gives way to another. One sealed place opens into a deeper one. One layer of secrecy peels back, only to reveal more beneath it. And so Rebecca and Billy move onward into the Umbrella Executive Training School. This place is one of the great early examples of how Resident Evil turns architecture into unease. The building has the shape of a school, a manor, a corporate heritage site, almost something dignified. But that dignity is false. Behind lecture halls, offices, corridors, and ceremonial spaces lies the old pulse of Marcus's work and Umbrella's hidden history. The training facility is not just a location, it is an archive of concealed intention. Every locked room, every hidden document, every dormant lab and blood-marked hall suggests that this place was built for dual purposes. Publicly, it represented education, advancement, the grooming of Umbrella's inner class. Secretly, it housed research, control, and the continuation of projects too dangerous for daylight. That doubleness is important. Resident Evil's environments are rarely only practical settings for combat and survival. They are moral diagrams. A grand training institution becomes a tomb of ambition. A mansion becomes a disguised laboratory. A police station becomes a trap. A hospital becomes a corridor of contamination. The surface always promises order. The depth always reveals corruption. Rebecca and Billy explore the facility together, and as they do, the story begins to shift from immediate survival toward understanding. They encounter more infected creatures, more evidence of viral instability, more records tying the outbreak to Marcus and Umbrella's old crimes. The horror remains physical, of course. Monsters, blood, locked doors, sudden danger. But now it also becomes interpretive. The place begins to speak. And what it says is not comforting. It says that the outbreak is not random. It says that this has happened because people built it to happen eventually. It says that years of secrecy have accumulated into consequence. One of the most haunting presences in this chapter is the returning figure associated with James Marcus. Through the Leech-based mutations and the grotesque life forms that imitate human shape and memory, Marcus's legacy becomes almost theatrical. There is revenge in it, certainly, but also something stranger. He is not restored to life in any peaceful or stable sense. Rather, his research has made it possible for memory, will, and mutation to blend into a monstrous continuation. The Queen Leech stands at the center of this horror. In a literal sense, it is a mutated organism shaped by the biology Marcus studied and by the viral systems he helped unleash. In a symbolic sense, it is the past refusing burial. Umbrella tried to eliminate Marcus as a problem, but because the company was built on unstable transformation, elimination only altered the form of the return. This is such a key idea in Resident Evil. You cannot create a world of biological distortion and expect clean endings. The dead come back wrong. The past comes back wrong. The evidence comes back wrong. The Queen Leech appears at times in the shape of a younger Marcus, and that image is unsettling for a reason. It is not quite resurrection. It is imitation charged with grievance. It creates the uncanny sensation that the training facility is haunted, but not by spirit in the traditional sense. It is haunted by biology, remembering violence. Rebecca and Billy, caught inside this web of history and mutation, continue deeper into the facility and its surrounding structures. Their partnership grows stronger through necessity, but also through revelation. Rebecca learns more about Billy, and the simple official story of him as a remorseless murderer begins to break apart. This part of the narrative matters because Resident Evil often places its protagonists inside systems of false classification. Files say one thing, reality says another. Billy had been condemned for the murder of civilians during a military operation, but the truth is more complex and more tragic. He had served under command in conditions shaped by brutality and moral collapse. He became the scapegoat for a situation rooted in corruption above him. In other words, he was not innocent in the childish sense of purity, but neither was he the monster his record suggested. The state had simplified him. Rebecca comes to understand this gradually, and that change in her perception is important. It reflects one of the larger moral structures of the series. Institutions lie, and survival often depends on seeing through their categories. Billy, for his part, recognizes something in Rebecca as well. She is not merely a naive young officer who happened into the wrong place. She is brave under pressure, quick-thinking, compassionate without being foolish, able to keep moving even when horror strips away all ordinary reference points. Together, they form one of the more quietly affecting partnerships in the franchise. There is no long, safe future being promised here. That gives their connection a special fragility. It exists in crisis. It is built under pressure. And because of that, it feels real. As they continue their investigation and fight for survival, Rebecca and Billy move through more of Umbrella's hidden structure. Laboratories, treatment areas, underground systems, waterworks, and chambers where the company's respectable mask falls away entirely. The facility begins to feel less like a single building and more like an organism of secrecy. One room leads to another, one passage to another, and everything seems built to keep the truth fragmented. This fragmentation is one reason Umbrella remained powerful for so long. No single person below the highest levels necessarily saw everything. Compartmentalization protects evil by making it feel partial. A scientist works on samples. A guard protects a corridor. An administrator files reports. A transport operator moves cargo. Each part can pretend not to know the whole. But Rebecca and Billy, moving through the ruins, begin to see enough of the whole to understand what kind of company Umbrella truly is. The creatures they encounter along the way are not just isolated experiments gone wrong. They are evidence of a worldview in which living beings can be reshaped, improved, weaponized, and discarded according to institutional need. Zombies are only one expression of that logic. The mutated animals, the leech-based horrors, the unstable humanoid forms, all of them arise from the same root idea. That idea is domination through biology. As the Queen Leech's presence becomes more direct, the story takes on an increasingly operatic tone. Marcus's revenge is not limited to one act of violence. It feels like an unraveling. The training facility is being forced to reveal what it once concealed. And because the series understands atmosphere so well, that revelation happens through space as much as through exposition. A ruined hallway tells a story. A bloodied operating room tells a story. A locked executive chamber tells a story. A portrait on a wall tells a story. The facility is full of stories, all of them unfinished, all of them now interrupted by outbreak. The arc of Resident Evil 0 moves steadily toward destruction, because places like this cannot remain standing in narrative or moral terms. A secret training school that housed viral research and became the site of Marcus's distorted revenge cannot simply be left behind intact. Something has to burn, collapse, or sink. Resident Evil understands that some architecture is too guilty to survive symbolically, and indeed, the facility heads toward ruin. But before we reach that end, Rebecca and Billy must confront the Queen Leech directly. This confrontation is not only a fight for survival, but a final encounter with Umbrella's first buried betrayal. Marcus's legacy has moved through mutation into vengeance, and now the younger people dragged into this history must bear the cost of resolving it. There is something sad about that. Rebecca and Billy did not create Umbrella. They did not order the killings. They did not shape the viral programs. And yet, they are the ones bleeding in the corridors, solving the puzzles, opening the doors, and facing the abominations that older men with power created and hid. This is another recurring truth in Resident Evil. The innocent or semi-innocent inherit the debts of the ambitious. The confrontation with Queen Leech ultimately brings the old cycle to its breaking point. Light, exposure, and destruction become important motifs here. What was hidden begins to fail in the open. What thrived in subterranean secrecy cannot fully endure under revelation. That symbolism fits perfectly with the broader series. Umbrella survives this incident institutionally, yes, but its secrets never survive unchanged once brought into light. Rebecca and Billy succeed, but as always, success in this world is partial. They are not triumphant heroes stepping out into safety. They are survivors emerging from one sealed nightmare into a landscape where worse is still waiting. The Arklay Mountains remain full of danger. Umbrella's wider network remains active. And most importantly, the path leading directly toward the Spencer Mansion is now almost complete. This is the key transition. Resident Evil 0 does not end the outbreak. It clears the stage for the next one. Rebecca, exhausted and changed, separates from Billy near the end of the incident. Their goodbye carries a quiet melancholy. Billy's future is not one that can easily fit into official structures. For all practical purposes, he must disappear. Rebecca, on the other hand, continues forward into duty, into S.T.A.R.S, and into the next horror waiting just nearby. There is a tenderness in how Billy chooses to vanish. He does not demand some impossible reintegration into a world that has already condemned him. Instead, he accepts absence as the only viable freedom left to him. Rebecca, in turn, silently bears the knowledge of who he truly was, or at least enough of it to understand that the official record did not deserve him. Their parting is one of the quieter, more human endings in the franchise. No grand speech, no safe resolution. Just two people who survived something unspeakable, meeting at a crossroads where one must return to history and the other must disappear from it. Rebecca then continues toward the next mission point, toward the Spencer Mansion, where the rest of Bravo Team's disappearance, the Alpha Team investigation, and the most iconic early events of Resident Evil are about to unfold. This is where the timeline tightens beautifully. The events of Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil 1 are not distant chapters. They overlap at the edge. Rebecca is not a separate protagonist in some remote prehistory. She walks directly from one nightmare into the threshold of another. That is brutal and very Resident Evil. One could even say that she receives no true interval of recovery. And perhaps that is why her presence in the mansion later feels so fragile, so quietly haunted. She has already seen far too much. Meanwhile, the hidden systems around the mansion remain in place. Umbrella's laboratories beneath the estate are active or recently active. Experimental organisms have escaped containment. The viral nightmare is ready to surface more fully. S.T.A.R.S, still not fully aware of what lies ahead, will soon enter the region under the assumption that they are investigating a series of bizarre murders and the disappearance of their own people. They will find far more than that. Let us pause here and feel the atmosphere of this transition. A mountain road at dawn, ruined facilities behind the trees, Rebecca carrying fatigue, trauma, and duty all at once. Billy disappearing into a life beyond official memory. Umbrella's old betrayal unresolved at the corporate level, even if one local expression of it has burned out. And ahead, somewhere in the forest, a mansion waiting with lights in the dark. This is one of the reasons the early Resident Evil timeline is so effective. The horror is layered. It does not begin fresh with each title. It accumulates. Every place has a past. Every outbreak has roots. Every monster emerges from prior decisions. By the time the Spencer Mansion enters the story fully, it is not simply a spooky location. It is the next chamber in a buried machine already in motion. In the next part, we will move directly into the mansion incident, the disappearance of Bravo Team, the arrival of Alpha Team, the first major appearances of Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, and Albert Wesker in the main timeline, and the outbreak inside the Spencer Mansion that defines Resident Evil 1. For now, let the training facility sink back into silence. Let the leeches scatter into darkness. Let Billy vanish into the trees. And let Rebecca walk, tired and still alive, toward the old mansion where Umbrella's secrets are waiting to open their doors one more time. And now, let us continue. The mountains are still quiet from a distance. The forest still seems ordinary under moonlight. The road still winds through the Arclay region, as though nothing unnatural has ever happened there. And yet by now, we know better. Beneath the trees, behind old stone walls, under the polished image of wealth and architecture, a hidden history has already ripened into catastrophe. Rebecca Chambers has survived the train and the training facility. Billy Cohen has disappeared into the shadows of a world that will not remember him properly. And now the story moves toward one of the most iconic places in all of survival horror, the Spencer Mansion. If Umbrella represents the secret corruption of institutions, then the mansion represents that corruption made physical. It is not merely a house. It is not merely a laboratory. It is both. And that is what makes it so powerful. On the surface, the Spencer mansion appears like an old aristocratic estate, isolated, elegant, full of art, wood, stone, candlelight, and ceremonial grandeur. It carries the atmosphere of inherited wealth, private taste, and classical order. It looks like a place built to separate its owner from the ordinary world. But beneath that cultivated surface lies something far more modern and far more horrifying. Hidden research spaces, experimental chambers, transport systems, viral development zones, containment areas, and the mechanical heart of Umbrella's private bioorganic nightmare. This blending of old-world elegance and high-tech secrecy is one of Resident Evil's great visual and thematic achievements. The mansion tells us immediately what Umbrella is. A beautiful lie built on buried violence. By the time the mansion incident begins, strange murders and disappearances in the Arklay Mountains have already alarmed local authorities. Reports describe mutilated bodies, bizarre attacks, and unexplained deaths. The situation feels irregular enough that the Raccoon Police Department sends out its elite tactical unit once again, S.T.A.R.S. As we mentioned before, Bravo Team had already gone into the region and failed to return safely. Now, Alpha Team is sent to investigate Bravo Team's disappearance. This is where several of the most important characters in Resident Evil enter the timeline in unforgettable fashion. Among them are Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, Albert Wesker, and each of them carries a different emotional and narrative weight into the story. Let us begin with Chris. Chris Redfield is one of the central pillars of the entire franchise. In these early events, he is already capable, courageous, and strong-willed, but not yet the hardened global anti-bioterror veteran he will later become. Here, he is still closer to the beginning, a talented S.T.A.R.S member with military training, good instincts, and a moral core that will be tested again and again. Chris matters because he is one of the people in this universe who continues, despite everything, to resist numbness. He becomes tired, scarred, and burdened by loss. Yes. But he never stops opposing what Umbrella and its successors represent. That opposition begins here. Jill Valentine, likewise, is one of the great protagonists of Resident Evil. Intelligent, observant, resourceful, and highly adaptable, Jill embodies a different but equally vital kind of strength. She is not simply the female lead in some narrow sense. She is one of the sharpest survivors in the entire series, someone capable of staying functional amid terror, solving problems under pressure, and carrying fear without surrendering to it. Barry Burton brings another tone into the team. Older, steady, physically strong, and often carrying the aura of a dependable comrade, Barry initially appears as the sort of reassuring presence any dangerous mission would need. There is a humanity in Barry that makes later complications more painful because he feels like someone who should be safe to trust. And then there is Albert Wesker. Wesker is one of the most important and unsettling figures in the entire franchise. At this point in the timeline, he appears outwardly as the captain of S.T.A.R.S, calm, authoritative, composed, professional. He fits the role of elite commander almost perfectly. He wears control very well. That is part of what makes him so dangerous, because Wesker, from the beginning, is not what he appears to be. Alpha Team enters the Arklay region by helicopter, searching for Bravo Team and trying to determine what has happened in the forest. But like so many missions in Resident Evil, the descent into horror happens very quickly once the ordinary assumptions begin to fail. The team finds signs of Bravo Team's helicopter. The atmosphere is tense. Then comes one of the most famous turns in the series. The team is attacked by monstrous dogs. These are not normal animals. These are infected, mutated creatures, terrifying not only for their speed and violence, but because they transform something familiar into something irreparably wrong. This is such a perfect Resident Evil moment. The threat is immediate, physical, and impossible to rationalize in ordinary terms. The team is forced to flee. In panic and confusion, they race toward the nearest shelter they can find, the Spencer Mansion. And so they enter. They think they are escaping the nightmare outside. In truth, they are entering its center. That movement, from wilderness into architecture, from visible danger into hidden danger, is deeply important to the tone of the game and the story. It tells us that safety in this universe is always deceptive. Walls do not necessarily protect. Doors do not necessarily separate life from death. Shelter can be a trap. Inside the mansion, the first feeling is not immediate chaos, but eerie stillness. Grand rooms, long corridors, paintings, dining areas, statues, clocks, soft lighting, a place of taste and ceremony. And then, slowly, the reality reveals itself. A body, blood, signs of violence, the first zombie. This moment remains iconic because it captures the exact rhythm Resident Evil understands so well. Curiosity, unease, revelation, dread. The first zombie is not frightening only because it is violent. It is frightening because it turns toward the viewer too slowly, too impossibly, carrying the broken outline of a human being who should not still be moving. The undead in Resident Evil are not romantic monsters. They are tragic biological failures, and because of that, they feel close in a terrible way. The team becomes scattered within the mansion, and from here the story branches depending on perspective, but the core events remain consistent. Jill and Chris each navigate different parts of the mansion and its secrets, encountering locked puzzles, hidden passages, grotesque creatures, and the growing evidence that this place is tied to a much larger conspiracy. Rebecca Chambers also reappears in these events, linking the end of Resident Evil 0 directly into the mansion narrative. Her presence is one of quiet exhaustion and continuity. She has already survived one nightmare, and now she is caught inside another. There is something almost cruelly efficient about that. The mansion does not care what she has already endured. No place in Resident Evil ever cares how much trauma someone is carrying. It only adds more. As the investigation continues, the team encounters not only zombies, but a wider array of biological horrors. Giant spiders, mutated crows, hunters, experimental organisms released or escaped from Umbrella's hidden labs. Each one reflects another facet of Umbrella's experiments, another example of life treated as manipulable material. And as always, the architecture tells the story alongside the enemies. The mansion is full of keys, crests, secret doors, underground paths, laboratories concealed beneath luxurious design. It is a puzzle box made by people who believed secrecy was stronger than morality. To move through it is to solve the physical structure of concealment itself. This is why the mansion feels so unforgettable. It is not just haunted, it is organized. Every room belongs to a system. Every corridor was funded. Every hidden mechanism was built on purpose. At the center of the human drama inside the mansion lies the slow revelation of betrayal. Barry, who at first appears reassuring, behaves strangely at times. His actions are inconsistent, evasive, and suspicious. This is not because he is secretly evil in the simple sense, but because he is being manipulated. Wesker is using leverage against him, specifically Barry's family. to force compliance. This matters because Barry's moral weakness is rooted in love, not ambition. He is compromised because he is trying to protect those closest to him. Resident Evil often places people in exactly these tragic positions where the wrong choice comes wrapped in something deeply human. Wesker, meanwhile, grows increasingly central as the mask begins to slip. The deeper the survivors move into Umbrella's hidden structures, the clearer it becomes that this incident is not an unfortunate, isolated outbreak. It is a test, a betrayal, and a data-gathering opportunity. Wesker is not merely trying to survive the mansion, he is using it. This is one of the most important revelations in the early timeline. Wesker, while serving publicly as S.T.A.R.S. captain, is in truth deeply tied to Umbrella. He has been placed in this scenario as an observer and manipulator, intended to gather combat data on the BOWs by having S.T.A.R.S confront them. In other words, the team is being used as live test material. That is an astonishing betrayal. Not simply neglect, not simple corruption, but active orchestration. The people entering the mansion believe they are investigating a crisis. Wesker knows they are also part of an experiment. This revelation changes the emotional shape of everything. The team was never merely unlucky. They were selected into the machinery. Among the most important experimental creatures in the mansion is the Tyrant. The Tyrant is one of Umbrella's most iconic BOWs because it represents the company's dream in concentrated form, a humanoid bioweapon engineered for lethal efficiency. Strong, intelligent enough in combat terms, durable, grotesquely powerful. The Tyrant is not random mutation. It is design. That makes it especially disturbing. A zombie is horrifying because infection has reduced a human being to ruin. A Tyrant is horrifying because someone wanted this outcome. Wesker, true to form, attempts to use the Tyrant as part of his larger game. But as is so often the case in Resident Evil, the systems of manipulation become unstable. Creatures do not remain obedient in the way their designers imagine. Betrayers are not always protected by their own plots. Wesker himself is attacked by the Tyrant in one version of the confrontation, seemingly killed. Though in classic Resident Evil fashion, appearances will not remain simple for long. The final stages of the mansion incident move downward, into the labs beneath the estate. This descent is symbolic as much as physical. The survivors move beneath the beautiful lie into the raw mechanism of Umbrella's work. There they find the truth in full. Research files, viral evidence, the scale of the experiments, and the real nature of the outbreak. The mansion was never the whole story. It was the cover. The lab is the confession. Chris, Jill, Barry, and Rebecca, depending on the route and version, ultimately fight to escape as the facility moves toward destruction. Self-destruction systems, explosions, collapsing infrastructure. All of it reflects the same recurring necessity we have seen before. Umbrella's hidden places tend toward obliteration because exposure threatens the structure that made them possible. Yet even when the facilities burn, the truth never fully disappears. Enough survives. A sample, a witness, a file, a person. The survivors escape the mansion, often by helicopter, leaving behind fire, wreckage, and the first major chapter of Resident Evil's visible horror. But survival is not resolution. That is another law of this universe. The mansion incident does not end Umbrella. It does not stop the research worldwide. It does not bring immediate justice. Instead, it creates something more fragile and more dangerous: knowledge. Chris and Jill now know what Umbrella is capable of. Rebecca knows even more than most. Barry knows how close betrayal came to destroying them all. And somewhere beneath the ashes, Wesker's story is not as finished as it seems. Let us pause here and feel what the mansion means in the timeline. It is the point where private nightmare becomes shared witness. The point where Umbrella's hidden world first tears open in a way that survivors can carry outward. It is the birth of Chris and Jill not just as officers, but as long-term enemies of bioterror. It is the beginning of Wesker's evolution into something much larger than a corrupt captain. And it is the first great proof that Umbrella's respectable face is only a mask stretched over laboratories, corpses, and ambition. The survivors will not be believed easily. That, too, is important. Raccoon City does not immediately awaken in full moral clarity. Institutions resist truth. Corporations hide. Officials deny. The machinery that allowed Umbrella to flourish does not simply collapse because one mansion burned. It continues. And because it continues, worse is coming. In the next part, we will move into the spreading aftermath of the mansion incident. Chris and Jill's attempts to expose Umbrella, the surviving threat, the events around Claire Redfield and Leon S. Kennedy, the outbreak in Raccoon City, and the beginning of the great urban catastrophe of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3. For now, let the mansion rest in silence. Let the candles go dark. Let the shattered windows reflect only moonlight. Let the lab fires cool beneath the stone. And let that long night in the Arklay Mountains settle into memory as the moment Resident Evil truly stepped out of secrecy and began its slow spread into the wider world. And now, let us continue. The Spencer Mansion is behind us now, burned and broken in the hidden quiet of the Arklay Mountains. Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, and Rebecca Chambers have survived. They have seen enough to understand that Umbrella is not merely reckless, it is catastrophic. And yet, the world beyond the mansion does not suddenly become clear or honest. Institutions resist truth. Officials hesitate. Evidence is buried or discredited. Power protects itself in exactly the way power so often does. The survivors know what happened, but knowing is not the same thing as winning. In fact, in Resident Evil, knowledge often feels like the beginning of a more painful struggle. After the mansion incident, Chris and Jill attempt to expose Umbrella and continue investigating its activities. They understand that what happened in the Arklay region was not an isolated nightmare. It was one expression of a much larger system. They also understand something even more terrifying. If Umbrella is allowed to continue, the next disaster will not stay hidden in a mansion. It will spread. And it does. The city most intimately tied to this unfolding catastrophe is Raccoon City. Raccoon City is one of the most important locations in the entire franchise because it represents the moment when secret horror becomes civic collapse. Before this, Umbrella's crimes lived largely in hidden facilities, remote estates, and concealed compounds. But Raccoon City changes the scale of everything. The nightmare enters streets, shops, police buildings, hospitals, sewers, subways, homes, ordinary life. The city becomes the place where bioterror moves from private nightmare into public ruin. On the surface, Raccoon City is not an extraordinary metropolis. That is part of the point. It is a mid-sized American city, familiar enough to feel ordinary, but deeply entangled with Umbrella's influence. The company supports the local economy, provides jobs, shapes infrastructure, and exerts quiet power over civic life. This relationship makes the coming catastrophe even darker. Raccoon City is not simply attacked by evil from outside. It has already been living with it, depending on it, tolerating it. That is one of the deeper moral tragedies of the setting. The city's downfall begins through viral contamination tied to Umbrella's research and waste systems, especially through the sewers and local water network. The T-virus, developed through Umbrella's experiments, spreads beyond control. Infection escalates. People die, reanimate, attack others, and the city begins its descent into mass chaos. What makes the Raccoon City outbreak so haunting is how quickly ordinary structures lose meaning. A street is no longer just a street. A police station is no longer a source of order. A hospital is no longer a place of healing. Everything becomes inverted. That inversion is one of the core feelings of Resident Evil. The familiar turns hostile. The trusted turns lethal. The systems meant to protect people become overwhelmed, corrupted, or repurposed by catastrophe. And into this collapsing city enter two of the most important characters in the entire franchise, Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield. Let us begin with Leon. Leon is one of the most beloved and enduring figures in Resident Evil, and part of that comes from how his story begins. He does not enter Raccoon City as a hardened veteran. He enters it as a rookie police officer, arriving for what should have been the start of his first day with the Raccoon Police Department. There is something almost cruelly perfect about that. A first day, a new beginning. A young man stepping into adulthood, duty, and public service. And instead of routine, he arrives to find apocalypse. Leon's early characterization matters enormously. He is brave, sincere, inexperienced, and morally grounded. He does not yet have the polished competence or fatigue of the later versions of himself. Here, he is still close to the beginning, and that gives his actions a certain purity. He is not acting because he has become a specialized bioterror operative. He acts because people need help, because danger is present, and because his conscience is immediate. Claire Redfield enters the city for a different reason, but one equally personal. She arrives searching for her brother, Chris Redfield, whose absence and investigations into Umbrella have drawn her toward Raccoon City. Claire is not law enforcement. She is a civilian, though capable, intelligent, and resourceful. This gives her a different emotional position in the outbreak. She is not there because duty assigned her. She is there because family drew her in. That matters. Resident Evil often becomes more powerful when global horror passes through intimate motives. Claire is not chasing conspiracy for abstract reasons. She is looking for her brother. And in doing so, she steps into one of the most catastrophic nights in the series. Leon and Claire arrive separately, but fate quickly pulls them together. The city is already collapsing. Fires burn. The dead move through streets. Civilians flee, scream, crash vehicles, or vanish into infection. The police force is overwhelmed. Communication is fractured. Every structure of order seems to be dissolving at once. The first sensation of Raccoon City in this era is not only fear, it is disorientation. The city does not yet feel fully dead. It feels like a place in the process of dying. That is more unsettling. There are still lights, still sirens, still movement, still traces of people trying to live through it, and that makes the ruin feel immediate and human. Leon and Claire eventually make their way toward what should be a place of relative safety, the Raccoon Police Department, or RPD. But the police station, like so many supposedly secure institutions in Resident Evil, has already become a labyrinth of danger. The RPD is one of the most iconic locations in the franchise, and it works so well because it combines order, bureaucracy, and civic symbolism with architectural unease. It is both public institution and Gothic maze. Corridors are dark, doors are sealed, records are scattered, officers are dead or dying. The place feels at once official and unreal, as though law itself has been swallowed and rearranged. Inside the station, Leon and Claire encounter the remains of the city's failed defense. They find signs of bravery, panic, corruption, and hopelessness. They also encounter one of the most important supporting figures in this era, Marvin Branagh. Marvin is a wounded officer who remains calm and helpful despite his fatal condition. He is one of those smaller Resident Evil characters who matter deeply because he preserves humanity inside collapse. He knows things are almost certainly beyond saving for him, and yet he still chooses to guide others, to warn them, to help them move forward. That choice matters. In a series full of betrayal and manipulation, characters like Marvin remind us that decency still exists. It just often comes at great cost. As Leon and Claire move through the city and the station, the outbreak reveals more of its layers. The infected are not the only threat. Umbrella's experiments have produced other creatures, and the city is crawling with manifestations of scientific violence. Lickers, mutated beings with exposed musculature and terrifying mobility, become some of the most memorable examples of this. They are not slow, tragic figures like zombies. They are aggressive predators, evidence of the virus reshaping life into combat horror. And then the story introduces one of its most important children, Sherry Birkin. Sherry is the daughter of William Birkin and Annette Birkin, and through her the story draws together science, family, and innocence under pressure. Sherry is not simply a child to rescue. She is a living link to Umbrella's next major mutation crisis. Her parents are deeply connected to a new and even more dangerous development, the G virus. If the T virus is the great contaminant of the early outbreak era, the G virus represents another stage of biohorror, less about mass infection and more about grotesque mutation, regenerative monstrosity, and unstable transformation driven by aggressive biological takeover. The central figure of this stage is William Birkin. Birkin had once been a brilliant Umbrella researcher, deeply involved in viral development and highly valuable to the corporation. Like many of Umbrella's scientists, he believed himself essential. Like many of Umbrella's scientists, he underestimated how quickly value becomes expendability within such systems. When Umbrella decides to seize Birkin's work, especially the G virus, the confrontation turns violent. Birkin is shot by the very forces sent to control the situation. In desperation, he injects himself with the G virus. And this is one of the most important transformations in early Resident Evil. Because Birkin does not simply survive, he mutates. Again and again. The G virus does not merely infect. It overtakes, proliferates, reconstructs. Birkin becomes a towering, tragic, monstrous force moving through the city's underground spaces and institutions. Unlike a zombie, Birkin retains something of directed will at first, but his form becomes increasingly distorted, increasingly consumed by its own biological momentum. There is something especially sad about Birkin. He is monstrous, yes, but he is also the logical outcome of Umbrella's worldview turned inward. A scientist who tried to master transformation becomes its victim. A father becomes a predator, moving through the same spaces as his daughter. Ambition becomes body horror. This is Resident Evil at its most tragic. Claire becomes closely tied to Sherry's survival, and through that bond, Claire's character deepens beautifully. She is not just evading monsters, she is protecting someone vulnerable while trying to navigate a city collapsing around them. Claire's courage becomes maternal in a broad emotional sense, not because the game tries to reduce her, but because it shows her capacity for fierce care under impossible conditions. Leon, meanwhile, becomes entangled with another important figure, Ada Wong. Ada enters the story as mystery, elegant, composed, secretive, and always slightly beyond full explanation. She presents herself as someone searching for a man connected to Umbrella, but there is more to her than that from the beginning. Ada belongs to the part of Resident Evil, where espionage, corporate theft, and hidden agendas intersect with outbreak survival. She is not a simple civilian. She is not a simple ally. She is operating within her own mission, and that mission concerns the retrieval of valuable viral material. Ada changes the emotional texture of Leon's story. Around her, his sincerity meets ambiguity. He wants to help, to trust, to believe in purposeful action. Ada exists in shades of concealment and strategic detachment. And yet, there is real connection between them, which makes everything more complicated. Resident Evil often works best when intimacy and secrecy overlap. Leon and Ada embody that perfectly. And then, if Raccoon City were not already terrible enough, the story unleashes one of the most iconic pursuers in gaming horror, Mr. X, also known as the T-00 Tyrant. Mr. X is one of Umbrella's tyrants deployed into the city with a specific objective: eliminate survivors and recover targets of interest. If zombies represent environmental dread and Birkin represents mutational tragedy, Mr. X represents institutional pursuit. He is not chaotic. He is sent. That makes him deeply frightening. He walks with purpose. He does not rush in panic. He advances relentlessly. And because of that, he feels like a personified command structure, a suit-shaped execution order moving through the ruins. While Leon and Claire fight through the police station, sewers, and laboratory routes beneath the city, another major thread unfolds nearby: Jill Valentine's escape from Raccoon City. This is where Resident Evil 3 overlaps with the timeline. Jill, already a survivor of the mansion incident, has remained in the city trying to continue exposing Umbrella. But when the outbreak consumes Raccoon City, she becomes one of its key survivors. Her position is emotionally distinct from Leon and Claire's because she already knows what Umbrella is. For her, this is not the first revelation. It is the nightmare she tried to warn others about, now swallowing the city whole. Jill's story during the outbreak is marked above all by one name: Nemesis. The Nemesis T-type is one of Umbrella's most terrifying creations, a tyrant specifically deployed to eliminate S.T.A.R.S. members. It is intelligent enough to pursue targets, use weaponry, and adapt in ways more terrifying than earlier BOWs. Unlike Mr. X, whose presence is terrifyingly relentless, Nemesis feels personal. It is hunting Jill, not just wandering, not just attacking anything nearby. Hunting. That pursuit gives Resident Evil 3 its unique emotional pressure. Jill is not only surviving a ruined city, she is being specifically chased by a weapon designed to erase her. Nemesis is the embodiment of Umbrella's refusal to leave witnesses alive. And so the stories of Leon, Claire, Sherry, Ada, Jill, Birkin, Mr. X, and Nemesis all interweave through the city's final hours. This is what makes the Raccoon City era so rich. It is not one perspective on catastrophe. It is a whole civic ecosystem of collapse: rookie idealism, family loyalty, corporate espionage, maternal protection, institutional failure, bioweapon pursuit, and mutating science all unfolding at once beneath sirens and fire. Eventually, the survivors reach the underground laboratories and transport systems tied to Umbrella's urban operations. There, the truth becomes clearer still. Raccoon City was not merely unlucky. It was deeply compromised by Umbrella's presence, infrastructure, and experimentation. The city had been living above buried rot for too long, Sherry is infected during these events, further intensifying the tragedy around Birkin and the G virus. But she is ultimately treated through experimental means that allow her to survive. This matters because in Resident Evil, survival is rarely pure. People live through contamination, trauma, and irreversible knowledge. Sherry's future will carry all of that. Leon and Claire fight through Birkin's successive monstrous forms, while Leon and Ada's relationship moves through trust, deception, sacrifice, and uncertainty. Ada's apparent death in this era leaves emotional marks on Leon that will shape him deeply. Jill, meanwhile, survives Nemesis through relentless endurance, assistance from others like Carlos Oliveira, and a refusal to yield even when physically and emotionally drained. Carlos matters too. He enters through the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, or UBCS, a mercenary force deployed into the city ostensibly to assist, though, of course, the situation is far more complicated. Carlos is one of the rare characters associated with Umbrella-linked structures who nonetheless emerges as genuinely decent. He becomes an ally to Jill, and through him, Resident Evil 3 balances some of its relentless danger with human solidarity. In the end, Raccoon City becomes impossible to save. That is perhaps the central emotional truth of this chapter. The outbreak is too far gone. The city has become a wound too large for ordinary containment, and so the United States government authorizes its destruction. A missile strike erases Raccoon City. This is one of the bleakest events in the whole franchise. A city does not merely fall, it is removed. Its people, its streets, its institutions, its memories, all reduced to ash in the name of containment and political necessity. And yet destruction does not equal justice. Umbrella's crimes do not end here. The missile kills the evidence of a place, but not the system that made it. Still, the survivors escape. Leon survives, changed forever from idealistic rookie into someone who has seen the state fail, the corporation rot, and the dead walk. Claire survives, carrying her search for Chris onward, and taking with her the memory of Sherry and the catastrophe behind them. Sherry survives, though marked biologically and emotionally by everything that happened. Jill survives, though Raccoon City becomes one more scar laid over the mansion incident. Ada survives in the uncertain, hidden way only Ada can, and Umbrella, though wounded, remains. Let us pause here and feel the atmosphere of Raccoon City's end. Rain on ruined streets, sirens fading, a police station full of records no one will read in time, subway tunnels and sewers beneath a dying city, a child carried through nightmares, a rookie officer becoming something harder, a young woman refusing to abandon family, a survivor hunted by a bioweapon made for her specifically, a city waiting for fire from the sky. This is the turning point where Resident Evil can never again pretend to be only a local horror story. After Raccoon City, the world has been shown what biohazard truly means, even if governments and corporations continue to lie, obscure, and manipulate. The scale has changed, the cost has changed, the stakes have changed. In the next part, we will move into the aftermath of Raccoon City, Claire's journey toward Europe, the Ashford family, Rockford Island, Antarctica, Chris's return, Wesker's re-emergence, and the events of Resident Evil Code, Veronica, where the series begins to widen beyond the city into a more global and aristocratic nightmare. For now, let Raccoon City fall silent. Let the flames dim. Let the streets vanish under white flash. And let the survivors carry forward what the city no longer can: memory, grief, and the knowledge that the monster was never just the virus. It was the world that made one. And now, let us continue. Raccoon City is gone. Not healed, not saved, not remembered properly in the way it deserved to be remembered, but erased. Its streets, police station, hospitals, homes, and hidden laboratories have all disappeared beneath sanctioned fire. The city has been transformed from living place into scar, from evidence into absence. And yet, as always in Resident Evil, destruction does not end the story. It only changes the shape of what remains. Claire Redfield survives the fall of Raccoon City, but survival does not satisfy her. The search that brought her there in the first place still continues. She came looking for her brother, Chris, and though she escaped the city, she has not found him. That unresolved purpose carries her onward, farther from the local horror of Midwestern outbreak and into something colder, stranger, and more aristocratic. Because after Raccoon City, the Resident Evil timeline begins to widen. The conspiracy is no longer just about one city, one mansion, or one research network hidden beneath a few American facilities. It stretches outward into international structures, old bloodlines, island prisons, private military forces, and the lingering ambitions of people who believed they had the right to shape the future through biology. This is where Code, Veronica, enters the story. Claire, determined to find Chris and continue opposing Umbrella, infiltrates one of the corporation's facilities in Europe. She is no longer the same young woman who entered Raccoon City searching for her brother with courage and instinct alone. She has been sharpened by catastrophe. She understands now, in a way few civilians ever could, the scale of the threat Umbrella represents. She knows that these are not isolated experiments or unfortunate accidents. She knows the system is global. Her infiltration, however, does not go cleanly. It could not. Claire is captured and taken to Rockford Island, a place that perfectly reflects the next stage of the series' atmosphere. If Raccoon City was urban collapse, Rockford is isolation and inheritance. It is part prison, part private military holding ground, part aristocratic relic. It feels removed from ordinary human geography, which is exactly the point. Places like Rockford exist because power wants distance. Distance from law, distance from scrutiny, distance from consequence. The island is controlled by the Ashford family, or more precisely, by the decaying legacy of that family. And this is where we must return to one of the deeper roots of Umbrella. Earlier, we mentioned Edward Ashford, one of the foundational figures connected to Umbrella's creation. The Ashford name carried aristocratic pride, intellectual ambition, and a long obsession with excellence. In another world, perhaps such traits might have become merely eccentric or influential. In Resident Evil, they become poisonous when fused with virology, power, and inherited delusion. The Ashfords are important because they embody one of the franchise's most unsettling ideas, that scientific horror is often just aristocratic vanity wearing laboratory gloves. By the time Claire arrives at Rockford Island, the family's legacy has curdled into something theatrical, unstable, and deeply tragic. The central figure there is Alfred Ashford. Alfred is one of the strangest and most memorable antagonistic presences in the early timeline. He is not frightening in the purely physical way of a tyrant or a mutated creature. He is frightening because he feels like a person living inside inherited decay. His behavior is erratic, obsessive, performative, and saturated with the weight of family myth. He is both ridiculous and dangerous, and that combination makes him unnerving. He is the product of a house that worshipped bloodline and perfection until both became grotesque. Rockford Island itself is already unstable by the time Claire reaches it. An attack on the island has triggered outbreak conditions, and once again Umbrella's structures are collapsing into the consequences of what they were built to contain. The prison areas, military sections, and hidden research elements of the island become active nightmare space. Infected roam the compound. Security has broken down. The island is no longer merely a holding site. It is becoming a tomb. Claire, as always, adapts and survives. That is one of her defining strengths. She is not supported by institutional power. She is not a superhuman combat specialist in the exaggerated sense. She is a person who keeps moving, keeps thinking, and keeps protecting others even when the world around her insists on becoming less human. On Rockford Island, this becomes especially important because she meets Steve Burnside. Steve is a teenager, imprisoned on the island after his family became entangled in anti-umbrella matters. He brings a different emotional tone to the story, youthful, impulsive, frightened, often trying too hard to appear tougher or lighter than he really feels. At first, he can seem brash, even irritating, but beneath that is a wounded young person trying to survive circumstances far beyond his emotional preparation. That vulnerability makes him matter. Resident Evil is often strongest when it allows people to remain visibly human inside catastrophe, and Steve is one of those characters. He is not polished. He is not emotionally contained. He reacts like someone whose life has been torn apart and who is improvising his identity moment by moment. Claire and Steve form an uneasy but genuine bond as they try to escape Rockford. Their relationship is important because it gives Code, Veronica, a softer emotional undercurrent amid all its cold architecture and family madness. Claire, who already carries responsibility so naturally, becomes again someone who protects and steadies another person, while never abandoning her larger mission. As the story unfolds, the truth about the Ashford line becomes darker and stranger. One of the central hidden figures is Alexia Ashford, Alfred's sister. Or perhaps it is better to say, the idea of Alexia hangs over the story before her full return becomes real. The Ashford family had long been obsessed with reclaiming its former greatness. At the center of that obsession was the desire to restore excellence through genetic control and scientific manipulation. Alexia, from childhood, had been treated as a prodigy, a mind of astonishing brilliance, but one shaped within a family that had replaced love with project and humanity with design. This matters deeply, because Alexia is not simply an evil genius in a shallow sense. She is the flowering of an inherited pathology. She represents what happens when an aristocratic house attempts to breed and engineer superiority, then wraps those efforts in scientific ambition. She is brilliant, yes, but brilliance without moral structure becomes predation very easily in this universe. Alexia's defining connection is to the T. Veronica virus. This virus represents another branch in Resident Evil's expanding tree of biological horror. Like the G virus before it, it is not simply another color of contamination. It reflects a different research path, a different mutational philosophy, and another attempt to master transformation for specific goals. In Alexia's hands, the T. Veronica virus becomes tied not just to experimentation, but to self-directed metamorphosis. Her story is one of control taken to its ultimate narcissistic edge. Rather than merely create monsters, she seeks to become something beyond ordinary humanity herself. That aspiration, of course, leads exactly where such aspirations always lead in Resident Evil, into monstrosity. Meanwhile, there is another major force moving through these events, a presence we have not truly left behind since the mansion, though the world believed it had. Albert Wesker. Wesker's return is one of the most important developments in the timeline because it confirms something the series has been building for some time: that he is not merely a corrupt officer or hidden Umbrella operative, but a figure evolving into something far more central, more dangerous, and more unnatural. After the mansion incident, Wesker did not simply vanish into death. He survived, changed through experimental means, and connected to forces beyond ordinary Umbrella bureaucracy. By the time of Code, Veronica, he reappears as a highly capable, enhanced, calculating operator with his own agenda. He is no longer merely embedded within Umbrella's system. He is beginning to move above and beyond it. This shift matters enormously, because Umbrella, though still powerful, is now giving rise to successors, defectors, and predators who want its data, its viruses, its bioweapons, and its future, but not necessarily its corporate structure. Wesker becomes the clearest symbol of this transition. He is no longer just serving a hidden company. He is becoming a transnational manipulator in his own right. Claire's situation worsens as Rockfort spirals deeper into outbreak and violence. She and Steve are forced across prison zones, military compounds, private residences, and transport routes, while Alfred's instability escalates and the legacy of Alexia begins to surface more fully. The island, like so many Resident Evil locations, becomes a map of family pathology made physical. One section reflects militarization, another reflects imprisonment, another reflects wealth, another reflects experiment, and threaded through all of it is inheritance. The sense that every corridor is shaped by an old desire to preserve status through unnatural means. Eventually, the story pushes beyond Rockfort Island itself and into one of the most striking locations in the franchise, the Antarctic facility. There is something uniquely haunting about Antarctica in Resident Evil. Cold has always been part of the series' emotional palette, but here it becomes literal. Vast whiteness, isolation, silence, a research complex buried in ice. It feels like the world has moved as far as possible from ordinary life into a place where ambition hoped it could preserve itself untouched by history. But ice does not purify what is hidden beneath it. It only delays discovery. The Antarctic base continues the Ashford family's legacy of secret experimentation and theatrical grandeur. Alexia's story deepens here, and so does the tragedy of Steve. The T. Veronica virus, the family's desire for resurrection and superiority, and the biological distortions that follow all converge in this frozen environment. Steve, in particular, becomes one of the most painful examples of Resident Evil's tendency to wound the young. He and Claire have grown closer through survival. He is no longer just the reckless boy from the island prison. He has become someone capable of loyalty, feeling, and real courage. And because the series rarely allows tenderness to remain untested, that growth makes what follows much sadder. He is infected and transformed. This is such a devastating pattern in Resident Evil. A person begins to emerge more fully into care, trust, or selfhood, and then the viral world tears them away from themselves. Steve's mutation turns him into a weaponized form that briefly places him in opposition to Claire, but within him, some human feeling still struggles. His story becomes one of partial rescue and irreversible loss. Even when he regains enough consciousness to protect Claire, the damage is already too great. He dies, and his death lands with a quiet sorrow that suits this era of the series. Not grand heroic myth, not triumphant sacrifice, just another young life twisted by the ambitions of older people and older systems. Claire endures it, because Claire always endures. But endurance in Resident Evil is not immunity. Each survival leaves residue. Each loss remains. Now, While Claire is fighting through Rockfort and Antarctica, another critical movement takes place. Chris Redfield returns to the story. Chris, having continued his efforts against Umbrella after the mansion incident, comes in response to Claire's message and the events around her capture. His arrival is a major emotional moment because it fulfills the search that had brought Claire into so much danger in the first place. Brother and sister are finally drawn back together in the same thread of catastrophe. Chris, at this stage, is already becoming something harder and more focused than the man who entered the Spencer mansion. He is not yet the later global operative, but the direction is clear. His war against bioterror is becoming personal, sustained, and defining. Claire's survival strengthens that, but so does Wesker's reappearance. Because when Chris and Wesker begin to move again in overlapping space, the franchise gains one of its central long-term rivalries. Wesker is no longer just a traitor from the mansion. He is an evolved threat, faster, stronger, more cunning, and working toward purposes that reach beyond simple corporate espionage. Chris is no longer just a surviving officer. He is becoming one of the few people willing to pursue that threat relentlessly. Code. Veronica is therefore important not only for Claire's journey or the Ashford tragedy, but because it sets larger future lines in motion. It brings Wesker back decisively. It reconnects Chris and Claire. It expands the world beyond American outbreak into international conspiracy. And it shows that even as Umbrella weakens in some ways, the viral nightmare is becoming more distributed, more adaptable, and more attractive to new hands. Alexia herself eventually emerges fully, transformed through the T. Veronica virus into a being of great power, terrible beauty, and radical biological distortion. This is classic Resident Evil in one of its most operatic forms. She is no mere zombie or animal mutation. She is self-fashioned monstrosity, aristocratic ego fused with viral transcendence. Fire, blood, elegance, and mutation all mingle around her presence. The confrontation with Alexia pushes the story toward its climax. Chris and Claire fight not only for their own survival, but against the final expression of the Ashford family's diseased pursuit of perfection. In defeating her, they symbolically destroy not only a single enemy, but one of Umbrella's oldest aristocratic fantasies, that inheritance plus science can create a superior destiny. But as always, defeat is partial, because Wesker is there too. And Wesker does not leave empty-handed in the deeper sense, even when particular objectives fail. He learns, adapts, and continues. He is one of those figures who turns every encounter into future leverage. By the end of Code, Veronica, Claire, and Chris survive. The immediate Ashford nightmare is brought down. The frozen chambers, family illusions, and viral grandiosity of Rockfort and Antarctica are left behind in ruin. But what remains is larger than any one facility. Chris is now on a more direct path of pursuit against Umbrella and Wesker alike. Claire survives, but carries more grief and more proof that Umbrella's reach was never local. Wesker is fully back in the game, and the series has shifted again, away from city catastrophe alone and toward a wider world of hidden buyers, private operations, biological markets, and ideological predators. Let us pause here and feel the atmosphere of Code, Veronica, a prison island under red alarm light, a decaying noble house pretending bloodline is destiny, a brother sought across continents, a boy trying to become brave before it is too late, a frozen research palace buried in Antarctic silence, an aristocratic prodigy turning herself into viral royalty, and through it all, one man in dark glasses stepping back into history with calm, terrible purpose. In the next part, we will move into the fall of Umbrella as a public entity, the changing bioweapon landscape, Leon's new role, the events leading toward rural Europe, Las Plagas, Ashley Graham, and the transformation of the franchise through Resident Evil 4. For now, let the snow settle over Antarctica. Let Rockfort go dark. Let Steve's memory rest gently where the virus can no longer reach him. And let Chris, Claire, and Wesker carry forward from this frozen chapter into a world where the nightmare is no longer hiding in one company alone, but beginning to migrate into everything that company helped make possible. And now, let us continue. The world after code. Veronica is no longer the world that existed before Raccoon City. Too much has happened. Too many facilities have been exposed. Too many witnesses have survived. Too many viral branches have escaped the boundaries of the laboratories that created them. And perhaps most importantly of all, the illusion that Umbrella could contain its own ambitions has begun to collapse. For years, Umbrella had functioned as both cause and shield. It created the disasters, then used its wealth, influence, and hidden connections to obscure them. It made monsters, then shaped the narrative around the ruins. But systems like that do not last forever. Even if they survive one mansion, one island, one city, they begin to weaken when too many truths accumulate. And so, in this era of the Resident Evil timeline, we arrive at one of the most important transitions in the franchise: the fall of Umbrella as a public corporate giant. This fall is not a single, elegant event. It is not one courtroom revelation or one explosion that solves everything. It is cumulative. The mansion incident planted seeds. Raccoon City made those seeds impossible to fully bury. Code. Veronica widened the scope further. Investigations, evidence, public pressure, financial collapse, and the exposure of Umbrella's bioweapon crimes all begin to take their toll. The company's reputation shatters. Its stock collapses. Legal and political attacks intensify. The public face of the corporation begins to rot away, much as its experiments always did. This is deeply fitting. Umbrella helped create a world where biology could no longer remain stable. In the end, its own institutional body suffers the same fate. And yet there is an important sadness here, because the fall of Umbrella does not mean the end of what Umbrella made possible. That would be too easy. Corporations die. Data survives. Scientists defect. Samples are stolen. Private buyers emerge. Militaries adapt. Terror groups learn. The age of one dominant evil company begins to end, but the age it created continues. This is a crucial shift in Resident Evil. At first, the nightmare is centralized. Umbrella feels like the dark heart of the whole system. Later, the nightmare becomes distributed, harder to locate, harder to destroy. The viruses, parasites, and research philosophies that once belonged primarily to Umbrella now begin to move outward into a wider ecosystem of bioterror, black markets, hidden cults, rogue research cells, state actors, and ideological extremists. In other words, the problem becomes modern. And in that new world, several old characters take on new roles. One of the most important is Leon S. Kennedy. Leon survived Raccoon City as a rookie officer thrust into an apocalypse on his first day. That experience changes him permanently. It could hardly do otherwise. After the city's destruction, the U.S. government takes interest in him, not simply because he survived, but because he knows things. He has seen Umbrella's work up close, fought through impossible conditions, and proved himself under pressure. Leon becomes part of the machinery of the state, but in a different way than one might expect. He is not merely folded into bureaucracy. He is trained, refined, weaponized in a sense, though not in the monstrous biological fashion Umbrella preferred. He becomes a U.S. government agent, highly skilled, far more experienced, and shaped into someone capable of operating in extreme situations involving bioterror threats. This transformation is one of the most interesting in the series. Leon does not lose his humanity, but he does lose innocence. The young man who arrived in Raccoon City looking like a promising rookie becomes a far more composed, competent, and dangerous survivor. He carries trauma under the surface, yes, but also adaptability, wit, and a sharpened sense of duty. He learns to function inside a world where institutions are compromised, threats are transnational, and danger does not always wear the obvious shape of a zombie. This new Leon is the central figure who carries us into Resident Evil 4. And Resident Evil 4 marks another major tonal shift in the timeline. Not away from horror, exactly, but into a different kind of horror. If earlier Resident Evil is built around corporate virology, urban collapse, and laboratory secrecy, Resident Evil 4 introduces something older feeling, more rural, more ritualistic, more tied to parasite and cult than to pharmaceutical outbreak. The mission that begins this story seems, at first glance, almost straightforward. The president's daughter, Ashley Graham, has been kidnapped. Leon is sent to rural Europe to rescue her. Simple enough, in theory. But in Resident Evil, a simple mission is often just the outermost layer of something much stranger. Leon arrives in an isolated region of Spain, a place of villages, forests, old stone, and deep local silence. The landscape is beautiful in a severe and lonely way. It feels ancient, detached from modern civic life, almost like a place history forgot to update. This atmosphere matters enormously. Resident Evil 4 works because it replaces familiar urban panic with rural unease. Here, the danger does not initially feel like public collapse. It feels like isolation, a single road, a village that watches too quietly, people who do not behave normally, but also do not yet resemble the dead. This is one of the game's most important shifts. The infected here are not zombies in the classic sense, and the source of their condition is not the T-virus. Instead, we encounter Las Plagas. Las Plagas are parasitic organisms, ancient, powerful, and capable of controlling hosts in ways that differ significantly from Umbrella's usual viral nightmares. This matters because it expands the biological imagination of the franchise. Resident Evil is no longer only about viruses mutating tissue and reanimating corpses. It is also about parasitic domination, collective obedience, and the eerie horror of intelligence bent under infestation. Where zombies often represent decay and loss of function, the Ganados, the parasite-controlled villagers Leon encounters, represent something more unsettling in a different direction. They still speak. They still organize. They still use tools. They still move with intention. But something inside them has been taken over. That is chilling, because it preserves just enough humanity and form to make the violation feel more intimate. The village itself becomes one of the most unforgettable settings in the series. Leon arrives expecting leads, information, perhaps resistance. Instead, he finds hostility almost immediately. The villagers close in with cold purpose. They are not mindless, not shambling, not random. They are unified by a will not fully their own. And so Leon's mission becomes something much larger than rescue. It becomes an encounter with a new biological order. At the center of that order is the cult known as Los Illuminados. This group is vital to understanding Resident Evil 4's deeper themes. If Umbrella represented science without morality, Los Illuminados represent faith and control, corrupted through parasitism. They are cultic, hierarchical, ritualistic, and deeply manipulative. They do not hide their ambition beneath the language of medicine or public good. They frame domination through belief, purification, and spiritualized submission. That makes them different from Umbrella. Not better, just differently horrifying. Their leader is Osmond Sadler. Sadler is one of the franchise's most interesting antagonists because he blends religious charisma, strategic intelligence, and parasite-based power into a single figure. He is not merely a scientist in a lab coat, nor merely a screaming fanatic. He is controlled, deliberate, and deeply invested in a system where biological domination becomes a means of extending ideological control. Through Las Plagas, Sadler and Los Illuminados aim not just to create monsters, but to create obedience, and the implications of that are enormous. Ashley's kidnapping is tied directly to this plan. She is not merely a hostage. She is intended as a vector, a means by which parasitic control can reach the highest political levels. Infect the president's daughter, send her home, and the parasite gains access not simply to one victim, but to the symbolic center of American power. This is classic Resident Evil logic at a new scale. Biological infection used for political penetration. Leon, as the one sent to retrieve Ashley, is therefore walking into something much more sophisticated than a ransom scenario. He is stepping into a convergence of cult ambition, parasitic control, and geopolitical bioterror. And almost immediately, the mission becomes deeply personal, because Leon himself is captured and infected with Las Plagas. This is one of the key psychological pressures of Resident Evil 4. Leon is not only trying to survive and rescue Ashley, he is fighting a clock within his own body. The parasite is inside him. It has not yet taken full control, but the possibility is there. That changes the emotional texture of the story. Leon is not an untouched agent confronting external danger. He is implicated biologically. Once again, the franchise reminds us that contamination narrows the distance between hero and monster. Ashley, too, is infected, which means the rescue becomes even more complicated. Saving her is not enough. They must both reach a way to remove the parasite before control fully matures. Now, this brings us to another important figure, Leech Sarah. Leech is one of the most compelling supporting characters in Resident Evil 4 because he embodies the guilty insider. He was once connected to research involving Las Plagas and the groups exploiting it, but he becomes morally uneasy with what is happening. Like many Resident Evil characters, he exists in the gray space between complicity and redemption. He is charming, evasive, often difficult to read, but underneath that is someone trying, in the limited way available to him, to resist the full horror of what he helped enable. Leech matters because Resident Evil is full of clean villains and tragic victims, but some of its best characters sit between those categories. They are not innocent, yet they are not entirely lost. They try to give back what they can before the machinery swallows them. That attempt rarely ends peacefully. Another major figure woven into this era is Ada Wong. Ada's presence in Resident Evil 4 reintroduces the shadow world of espionage and biological theft that has followed the series for so long. She is not here by accident, and she is not here for Leon. Or at least, not only for Leon. Ada moves through this story with her own mission, tied to the retrieval of a Plaga sample and the interests of hidden employers. She and Leon still share that old, unstable chemistry. Trust mixed with secrecy, care mixed with manipulation, memory mixed with professional distance. Their relationship by this point has become almost mythic in its rhythm. Leon wants directness. Ada lives in layers. He acts from visible loyalty. She acts from hidden purpose. And yet neither fully escapes the emotional gravity of the other. Resident Evil returns to them again and again, because they represent one of its deepest tensions: the human pull toward connection inside systems built on concealment. As Leon and Ashley move through the village, castle, and island facilities connected to Los Iluminados, the environment shifts beautifully through distinct layers of horror. The village gives us rural hostility and parasite-driven social collapse. The castle introduces grotesque nobility, ritual, and Baroque madness. The island then draws the story back toward militarization and bio-weaponized infrastructure, showing how old cultic power and modern tactical systems can merge into something even worse. This layered progression is one reason Resident Evil 4 remains so memorable. It never lets one atmosphere stagnate. Instead, it keeps revealing new faces of the same horror. Within the castle, one of the key antagonistic figures is Ramon Salazar. Salazar is the latest in the long Resident Evil tradition of decayed aristocratic power. Small, theatrical, grotesque, and deeply bound to inherited authority, he reflects the same basic truth we saw with the Ashfords, though in a different form. Old privilege becomes especially dangerous when fused with biological corruption and devotion to larger evil. He serves Saddler, but he also carries the atmosphere of a family line that has become trapped inside its own ruin. Then there is Jack Krauser. Krauser's role is important because he represents another evolution of the series' world, the militarized defector. Once a U.S. soldier, later tied to covert operations, Krauser becomes a figure of betrayal, shaped by disillusionment, power-seeking, and his own path into enhancement. His presence ties Leon's government agent world to the broader bioterror marketplace, where former soldiers, operatives, and specialists may end up serving hidden interests rather than states. Krauser is not merely a brute enemy. He is a dark mirror, someone who moved through adjacent systems and chose another outcome. For Leon, that makes the conflict more personal and more ideological. Now, at the center of all of this is the question of control. Umbrella wanted control through virus, profit, and weaponization. Los Iluminados want control through parasite and faith. Ada's employers want control through acquisition and leverage. Krauser wants it through strength and strategic betrayal. Leon, in contrast, fights not to dominate, but to prevent domination. That contrast gives Resident Evil 4 its strange moral clarity beneath all the Baroque horror. Leon is moving through a world where everyone else seems to want to own biology for some higher project. He is trying to stop them from turning life into governance. Eventually, Leon and Ashley succeed in having their parasites removed through specialized technology, a crucial turning point that restores agency before it is fully lost. This matters not just for plot, but thematically. Resident Evil 4 is full of compromised bodies and invaded wills. To remove the parasite is to recover selfhood from colonization. Luis, meanwhile, pays heavily for his attempt to help. His story follows the Resident Evil pattern we know too well. Partial redemption purchased at fatal cost. And Ada continues her dance of assistance and concealment, helping Leon at key moments while never fully becoming the simple ally he might want her to be. The final phase of Resident Evil 4 moves toward confrontation with Saddler himself. By then, the rescue mission has become a battle over the future of bioterror in a post-Umbrella world. The old corporation may be collapsing, but its successor horrors are already alive, more ideological, more decentralized, and in some ways, more difficult to predict. Saddler is defeated. Ashley is saved. Leon survives. Ada, true to form, leaves with what she came for, or with enough of it to ensure the next chain of consequences. And this is one of the key lessons of Resident Evil 4. Victory is real, but never complete. The parasite cult is broken in this region, but the sample survives in circulation. The market for bioorganic control remains alive, and the franchise has now fully entered its global era. Let us pause here and feel the atmosphere of this chapter. A village at dusk, where everyone watches. A church bell ringing over parasite-driven obedience. A castle full of ritual, arrogance, and biological corruption. An island where cult and military infrastructure meet. A government agent carrying the memory of one destroyed city into another kind of nightmare. A kidnapped girl becoming more than a victim. A spy who never arrives without another purpose. A world learning that even after Umbrella, the horror can adapt. In the next part, we can move into the later era, the anti-bioterror organizations, Chris Redfield's growing role, bioterror in Africa, the return of Jill in altered form, Wesker's final major arc, and the events of Resident Evil 5. For now, let the village fall quiet. Let the castle doors close. Let the parasite loosen its grip, and let Leon drive away into dawn once more, carrying with him the same burden every true Resident Evil survivor seems to inherit. The knowledge that each nightmare ended only because another one had not yet fully arrived. And now, let us continue. One final time for this long chapter of the Resident Evil story. Umbrella has fallen as a public giant. Raccoon City is gone. Rockford Island and Antarctica have already shown us that the nightmare never belonged to one country alone. Leon has moved through rural Europe and survived a new age of parasitic bioterror. And the world, though it may not fully understand the shape of the danger, has changed forever. Because after all of this, bioterror is no longer a secret pattern visible only to a few survivors. It is becoming a global condition. The age of hidden labs beneath isolated mansions has given way to something larger. Black markets, militant groups, private sellers, state instability, ideological zeal, and a world where biological weapons can migrate across borders with terrifying speed. This is the era in which new institutions rise in response. One of the most important is the BSAA, the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance. The BSAA represents the world's attempt to build organized resistance against the spread of bioorganic threats. In a sense, it is the answer history tries to give after too many disasters. If Umbrella created the age of modern bioterror, then the BSAA emerges as one of the first serious efforts to confront that age internationally. And among the people most deeply tied to that effort is Chris Redfield. Chris has traveled a long road by this point. From the Spencer mansion, to the aftermath of Umbrella, to his pursuit of hidden networks and old enemies, he has become something much more than a survivor. He is now one of the defining faces of resistance against bioterror itself. But this transformation comes with a cost. Chris is no longer the man who simply reacts to horror as it appears. He has spent years chasing it, fighting it, losing people to it, and carrying the knowledge that each victory seems to generate only another mutation, another outbreak, another organization willing to exploit what should never have existed. That kind of life hardens a person. And yet Chris never fully becomes cold in the way the villains of Resident Evil are cold. He becomes burdened, driven, at times exhausted, but not empty. That matters, because Chris remains one of the few characters in the series whose strength still points outward toward protection rather than domination. The events of Resident Evil 5 take us to Africa, and this setting is deeply important, both atmospherically and historically. Earlier in the timeline, we spoke of the ancient flower and the roots of the progenitor virus in Africa. Now, in a sense, the the story is returning to one of its oldest buried origins. That gives Resident Evil 5 a cyclical quality. The nightmare has traveled across mansions, cities, islands, laboratories, and cult territories, and now it bends back toward one of the places where the seed of everything first took hold. Chris is sent to the Kajuju Autonomous Zone, where reports indicate black market bioweapon activity and the possibility of a dangerous bioorganic sale. There he is joined by Sheva Alomar, a BSAA operative from the West African branch. Sheva is one of the key emotional anchors of this chapter. Capable, intelligent, disciplined, and courageous, she is not merely a partner in gameplay terms or an auxiliary figure beside Chris. She is essential to the tone of the story. She brings local knowledge, operational skill, and an independent strength that balances Chris well. Where Chris carries long history and accumulated trauma, Sheva carries clarity, determination, and a grounded, practical intelligence. Their partnership works because it feels functional under pressure. They are not bonded by old shared history at first. They become effective together through trust earned in motion. That is often how the best Resident Evil partnerships function, not through idealism, but through mutual survival and mutual competence. When Chris and Sheva enter Kijuju, they find something immediately familiar in shape, but different in detail. The area is tense, crowded, unstable. People are behaving strangely. Violence is close to the surface. But this is not a classic zombie outbreak in the old Raccoon City sense. Here we are dealing with organisms and infectious agents descended from or related to the Plaga model, as well as other bioweapon developments. The infected here, often called Magini, retain enough coordination and aggression to make them feel like an evolved continuation of what Resident Evil 4 had already begun. Again, the series reminds us, the nightmare adapts. It learns new languages, enters new populations, and changes form according to who is using it and why. The deeper Chris and Sheva move into the region, the more they realize that this is not an isolated black market incident. It is part of a much larger operation involving hidden research, local devastation, and one of the most persistent and dangerous figures in the franchise, Albert Wesker. By now, Wesker is no longer just a returning antagonist. He is almost an organizing principle of the series' middle era. Everything we have seen in him since the mansion, concealment, ambition, adaptation, superiority, detachment, has continued to evolve. He has moved beyond serving Umbrella. He has become something like a post-Umbrella predator, feeding on the ruins of old systems and trying to shape the future through viral and parasitic power according to his own worldview. And that worldview has only become more extreme. Wesker sees ordinary humanity as inadequate, weak, in need of replacement or forced transformation. He is one of those Resident Evil villains for whom biological power is not just a weapon, but a philosophy. He believes in directed evolution, in superiority, in transcendence through engineered change. In this sense, he is spiritually close to Spencer, even if he is more dynamic and dangerous in action. Both men believe they have the right to decide what humanity should become. This is one of the deepest recurring horrors in Resident Evil. Not just mutation, but chosen mutation imposed by elitist will. Now, Chris's pursuit of Wesker is not only strategic, it is deeply personal. And part of that personal history centers on Jill Valentine. Because before the events of Resident Evil 5, Chris believed Jill had died. During an earlier confrontation involving Wesker, Jill was lost, or seemed to be lost, in a fall while helping stop him. For Chris, this was not merely another professional casualty. Jill was one of the oldest and most important people in his life, a survivor of the mansion incident, a partner in resistance, and someone tied intimately to the origin of his entire war against bioterror. To lose her meant carrying yet another grief into an already crowded inner world, but grief in Resident Evil is rarely allowed to settle peacefully, because Jill is not truly gone. Instead, she has been captured, controlled, and used. This revelation is one of the most emotionally effective parts of Resident Evil 5. Jill returns not as a free ally, but as someone whose body and will have been manipulated under Wesker's control. In some versions of the presentation, she appears almost spectral, pale, precise, distant, transformed in bearing, though still undeniably herself beneath the imposed control. It is deeply painful because it turns memory into confrontation. Chris is not merely fighting another monster. He is facing someone he thought he lost, and seeing her made into an instrument of the very world they once fought together. This is so classically Resident Evil. A person is not simply killed. They are used, modified, controlled, turned into a continuation of the system that hurt them. And the act of rescue, therefore, becomes more than extraction. It becomes a struggle for identity. Chris and Shiva eventually manage to free Jill from that control, and this is one of the quiet moral victories of the story. In a franchise where so many people are lost to infection, mutation, or manipulation, Jill's recovery matters enormously. It proves that violation is not always final, that sometimes a person can be brought back from the machinery that tried to rewrite them. But even that victory does not come without pain, because by this point, the larger threat is growing even worse. At the center of Wesker's new ambitions lies Uroboros. The Uroboros virus represents another major stage in Resident Evil's expanding biological mythology. Its symbolism is important even before we get to its practical horror. The name evokes the serpent devouring its own tail, a cycle, a closed circuit, self-consuming and self-renewing. That is deeply appropriate. Uroboros is not just a weapon, it is a statement of Wesker's worldview, a forced evolutionary filter through which only the worthy would survive. In practice, Uroboros is catastrophic. It mutates hosts into grotesque black tendrils, masses of biomass, and unstable forms of living horror unless they possess certain qualities Wesker deems compatible. It is less a pathogen of indiscriminate plague and more a brutal selection mechanism, which, of course, makes it even more ideologically sinister. Because now, the virus is openly tied to judgment, not healing. Not even ordinary military weaponization. Judgment. Wesker plans to use Uroboros on a global scale, effectively reshaping humanity through mass death and selective survival. It is Spencer's dream reborn in a more dynamic and apocalyptic disciple. Where Umbrella's early years hid behind commerce, Wesker is increasingly direct. He wants a new world, and he is willing to kill the old one to make it. Chris and Shiva follow the trail through villages, marshlands, ruins, industrial sites, underground labs, and launch facilities. Resident Evil 5, like several games before it, layers its locations carefully. We move from visible local outbreak into the hidden infrastructure behind it, from civilian terror to militant operations, from ancient roots to advanced delivery systems. The journey maps the logic of bioterror itself. It always begins somewhere embodied and local, then reveals the network beneath. Along the way, the story also returns to the old buried origins of the series through Oswell E. Spencer. By this stage, Spencer is no longer the powerful, distant architect he once was. He is old, diminished, and physically fragile. Yet his importance remains enormous, because he was one of the original dreamers of controlled evolution one of the men who saw the progenitor virus not as warning, but as opportunity. When Wesker confronts Spencer, we witness something symbolically rich, the ambitious child overtaking the aging father figure of the old order. Spencer talks of his vision. Wesker rejects even Spencer's remaining centrality. And then Spencer dies. This is a major turning point, because with Spencer's death, the old founding generation is effectively gone. The dream remains, but its original human source is fading into history. Wesker now stands not as heir within Umbrella, but as successor to its deepest ideology. He carries forward the belief that humanity must be remade by superior will through biology. That makes defeating him all the more important. The final phase of Resident Evil 5 moves toward open confrontation. Chris, Shiva, and the remnants of Jill's liberation arc converge on Wesker's attempt to deploy Uroboros. The settings become more extreme, the action more intense, but beneath all of it, the emotional structure remains clear. Chris is fighting for the whole long history now, for the mansion, for Raccoon City, for Jill, for every person bioterror erased or transformed. Shiva is fighting for the present landscape around her, for the lives and places being consumed by another imported catastrophe, and for a future not ruled by people like Wesker. And Wesker is fighting for the right to become history itself. His final transformed state, enhanced and increasingly monstrous, reflects one of the series' oldest laws. The one who seeks total control through biological power always becomes physically distorted by the very force he worships. In Resident Evil, the body always tells the truth eventually. A villain may speak in elegant terms of evolution and destiny, but mutation reveals the deeper reality, obsession made flesh. In the end, Wesker is defeated. And this defeat matters more than most. Not because it ends bioterror forever, it does not. Not because it heals the world, it cannot. But because it brings down one of the longest and most ideologically important enemies in the series. Wesker is not just another outbreak mastermind. He is the carried forward shadow of the mansion, of Umbrella, of Spencer, of every belief that biology belongs to the superior. His death feels like the end of a major age. Chris survives, Shiva survives, Jill survives, and the immediate Uroboros catastrophe is prevented. That is a real victory, a rare one in the full emotional language of Resident Evil. And yet, of course, the series does not end there, because the world has already changed too much. The age after Wesker is not peaceful. Bioterror networks continue. New outbreaks emerge. New agents, new organizations, new families of horror rise in the years ahead. Resident Evil will keep moving through global incidents, psychological collapse, family gothic horror, and increasingly intimate forms of nightmare. But for tonight, for this long telling, we stop here, at a fitting place, at the end of Wesker's long shadow. Let us step back and feel the whole shape of what we have traveled through. We began with ancient flowers, old ambition, and the buried foundations of Umbrella. We moved through James Marcus, leeches, trains, training facilities, and the road into the Spencer mansion. We watched Chris, Jill, Barry, Rebecca, and Wesker pass through the first great outbreak. We saw Raccoon City fall through the eyes of Leon, Claire, Sherry, Ada, Jill, Carlos, and the monsters that hunted them. We traveled to Rockfort Island and Antarctica, into the Ashford legacy and the return of Wesker. We followed Leon into the post-Umbrella world of parasite cults and hidden buyers. And now we have reached Africa, Progenitor, Uroboros, Jill's return, and the final collapse of the man who tried to stand above all of it. This is why Resident Evil endures. Because beneath the monsters and laboratories, beneath the weapons and conspiracies, it keeps telling the same dark human truth in new forms, that the desire to control life will always become a desire to control people, that institutions built on secrecy eventually rot from within, that the body remembers violence even when politics tries to erase it, and that survival is not the same thing as innocence, but it can still be a form of resistance. So now, let the laboratories go dark. Let the helicopters fade into distance. Let the ruined cities, islands, mansions, castles, villages, and hidden compounds settle into silence. Let Raccoon City remain at peace in ash. Let Steve rest. Let Marvin rest. Let Luis rest. Let the many unnamed victims of corporate ambition rest. Let Jill breathe freely again. Let Chris lower the weight he has carried, if only for a moment. And let the long history of viruses, parasites, betrayal, and survival drift gently into stillness. Beyond this ending, there are more Resident Evil stories. There is the further global age. There is trauma and recovery. There are the Winters family horrors. There are new outbreaks, old bloodlines, and deeper kinds of fear. But for tonight, this chapter is enough. Sleep well, and drift gently away from the locked doors, the flickering monitors, the hidden files, and the footsteps in the corridor, knowing that for now at least, the house is quiet.